सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया, that's it. But listen तो.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो, सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा। इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
In this edition of Global Print, dear viewer, I'm going to talk to you about the G20 summit. Now, it's almost upon us. Another week or so away. Delhi's looking really beautiful. Thousands and thousands of pots have been installed with their newly sprung flowers. Delhi's heritage buildings have been lit up in magenta, pink and blue and all kinds of other colors of the rainbow. The streets have been swept, something that you don't see regularly. It's just a marvelous city. And yes, the G20 slogan is the Sanskrit phrase, the very well-known and much-loved phrase, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, which means that the earth is one family. And that's the message that India wants to put out to the G20 nations, plus 9 other countries, which include Bangladesh, the UAE, Egypt, and some others. So 19 countries from the G20 group of world economies. India, of course, is the 20th, plus 9 other guests that have been invited by India. So 28 nations, the heads of state and government of 28 nations are going to be in Delhi for a couple of days over the 9th and 10th of September. And that's what my Global Print column this week for The Print is about. So I hope you will read it. And I look forward to your comments on this video as well. But before I go any further, dear viewer, I'd like to make an appeal to you. Please do subscribe and pay just a little bit for The Print's free, fair, objective, and unhyphenated journalism. We've been bringing you videos and stories, of course, for many years, right across the pandemic and since. And it's because of your contributions that it helps sustain the journalism of the kind that we do at The Print. So I hope you will continue to encourage us and to support us by subscribing and by paying that small sum of money. Now, back to my column, Global Print. The latest is that Xi Jinping, the president of China, may not be coming for the summit. He is likely to send his premier Li Qiang. If that happens, then I think it's both positive and negative for the G20 summit. The positive is that Prime Minister Narendra Modi and 1.4 billion Indians who are wondering how the Prime Minister is going to greet Xi Jinping, whose Chinese troops have been facing off against Indian troops for the last 3 years on the line of actual control in Ladakh. Now, that face-off, completely unprecedented. You remember that in the Galwan Valley in June of 2020, 20 Indian soldiers lost their lives, completely unprovoked. Nobody knows what happened, why it happened, what was the provocation. First of all, why have Chinese soldiers come and sat themselves on the LAC in Ladakh? And now it seems as if these Chinese soldiers are not allowing Indian patrols to patrol up to points or across areas that they did patrol until 3 years ago. So what is the message that the Chinese are trying to say? What is the message that Xi Jinping is trying to tell both Prime Minister Modi and India? So for Xi Jinping to have come to Delhi at a time like this to rub shoulders with all the world's richest economies, not just the richest economies, but economies that have a stake in the progress of the world, for Xi Jinping to come would have been really odd. And perhaps he realized that, which is why he's sending his premier Li Qiang. Now, this news has not been formally confirmed, but it is out there. So that's why we're all talking about it now. The other news is that the Russian President Vladimir Putin is also not coming to the G20. But this news has been out for the last few days. Putin is sending his very astute and sophisticated foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov. Now, Mr. Lavrov has been doing the job of a diplomat for the last several decades. He knows exactly what to say and when, which makes him a very interesting foreign minister. But the point is that Putin is Putin. Very, very powerful man, one of the most powerful in the world. Unfortunately, of course, he is busy with the war in Ukraine and will not be able to come to India for at least a day for the summit, which is a real pity because India is the one country in the world that would have welcomed Vladimir Putin. He has been sanctioned over the past year and a half since the invasion of Ukraine in February last year by the Western world. India has not joined those sanctions. In fact, India has abstained from several international resolutions, including at the UN, does not want to criticize or rap Putin on the knuckles, although India doesn't agree with the invasion of Ukraine. But the fact remains that Russia is a friend and has always been one, not just recently when India has been buying cheap Russian oil and shoring up its own economy, or at least not allowing prices to go out of whack. Because as we all know, India depends to a huge extent on imported energy. In fact, 80% of India's energy needs are imported from outside. Now, the cheap Russian oil has helped hugely in shoring up India's economy, not allowing prices to go out of whack, as I said earlier. But it's not just the Russian oil. Over the last several decades, Russia and before that, the former Soviet Union have been helping out India in its times of need. And Delhi doesn't like to forget a friend. But anyway, Putin isn't coming either. So that leaves Joe Biden, the president of the US. And he is coming. In fact, he is not going to the East Asian Summit, which the ASEAN nations are quite unhappy about. But he's choosing to come to the G20 instead. And there is a message in that. The message is that the US has decided that while it will go out of its way to try and stabilize the relationship between the US and China, which is why the US Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo has been in Beijing recently, but there is no question the Chinese are the key and main rivals of the Americans. And the Americans are not going to forget that in a hurry. So they will use every other trick in the book. And one key trick is to empower India to be able to not contain China, because that is a big word, not take on China, because that's an even bigger word, but to try and keep the Chinese in its own sphere. Now, the Chinese are expanding their presence internationally. They have bases in several parts of the world. Gwadar in Pakistan is not a base, but the Chinese have huge interests and huge stakes in Pakistan. Then you have Djibouti in Africa, which is a Chinese base. And across the Indian Ocean, across the sea lanes of communication, Indian ships and American ships are out there together, gathering intelligence and deciding strategy. The strategy is that the Indian Ocean must be kept free for the use of all ships, that it cannot become a Chinese ocean, and that the Chinese cannot have mastery over this piece of blue water, and that it must be kept clear. Now, the Indian Navy is trying its best to do that, but guess what? The US Navy is backing it in that attempt. So that's the message to China, which is that India, although it's 1/5 the size of China's economy, a much smaller economy, but the Indians are being backed by their good friends, the Americans. And so Xi Jinping, while he is perhaps one of the world's most powerful leaders, must understand and must realize that India, on whose line of actual control he has placed Chinese troops for the last 3 years, has friends who are willing to back India in its times of crisis. So there you have it, dear viewer. Putin isn't coming. And now, as it seems like likely neither is Xi Jinping. Now, of course, that makes the G20 summit a little less interesting, if you like, fewer fireworks, but at least the Ministry of External Affairs and its protocol division must be breathing quite a sigh of relief, because there's been a lot of concern, not just on how to seat Vladimir Putin and how to seat Xi Jinping around an oval table at the conference venue. I can confirm that the table is oval. It's not round, it's not square, nor is it rectangular. It's oval. And Prime Minister Modi will sit at the head of one gentle curve of that oval table. Now we don't know who's going to sit to the left or right of the prime minister, but we don't know. We don't know where Joe Biden is going to sit, for example. And now that neither Putin nor Xi Jinping are coming, it will be easier to seat the other. Similarly, for the photo op, it has been rumored for some time that the photo opportunity of all the G20 leaders was becoming an exercise in delicately balancing all their likes and dislikes and the relationships between the various countries that they represent. But now there's no Putin and there's no Xi Jinping, so that perhaps makes it easier. Although, like I said earlier, it's a little bit less interesting because you basically have now the Western group of nations. And yes, you have Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. And that's actually a really interesting member of the G20 because MBS, as he's popularly known, is also going to stay on for another day for a bilateral visit after the G20 gets over. So clearly he and Prime Minister Modi have lots to chat about. But even as India prepares to welcome all these leaders, it seems that there are some lessons that India must learn. If it wants the world to come invest in India, to make in India, then it also must realize that these countries and that their companies will only come to India if the business atmosphere is right. And that environment, that business environment cannot be full of malthink, if you like, RSS malthink, which passes off as Swadeshi economics. And some of it is that you cannot import computers from abroad, for example, or computer parts from abroad, for example. And the B20, which is a business 20 that was held just a few days ago right here in New Delhi, which was attended by some serious business from the Western nations, made that message very clear, both privately and publicly, which is that if India wants to be integrated, if it wants the value chains from China to be diversified and some of that money to be invested in the country, then India must understand that being part of a global value chain means that it has to import some of those parts, and that you cannot get emotional about it to say everything is made in India. Rara. Of course, it should be made in India, but some of those parts will be imported, and India will have to pay good money to do that. Now it seems, and that's the good news, that there is some rethink about this. The decision to reverse the import of computer parts and computers may not take place before the G20, but it is seriously being considered. And that is a message that Prime Minister Modi wants to send out to the world. Vasudev Kutumbakam is all very well, but if he wants to send the message that India wants to be not just a bit player, but a big player, then it must welcome the world with open arms to India and vice versa. That it must not hesitate in playing an equal role, that it must shed some of its prickliness that it has demonstrated these last several years, and must welcome people and must stand shoulder and shoulder with other leaders, as is the message that India's unique civilization brings. So I look forward to your comments and views on this video, dear viewer, and I hope you will read my column on the Print's website. Thank you so much for watching.